I was one of those who watched Andrea Bocelli when he was doing his concert in an empty cathedral in Milan.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now
I was moved by the sight of him singing Amazing Grace in front of the cathedral and without a live audience. It was the same feeling I had seeing the Pope holding Mass alone before the vast emptiness of St. Peter's Square, set against the magnificent backdrop of what are now largely relics of once Christian Europe. It set me into thinking that in these two images, one an artist and the other a priest, we see faith reasserting itself in the face of the vast emptiness in a world that has largely forsaken God. We live today in a social environment mediated to us by media. What we know about the world has been edited for us by anonymous authorities in newsrooms or manufactured by trolls behind computer terminals. We are informed or manipulated through the images that we see in media. So I wonder, what images do people see when they look at us as churches? In today's passages, Genesis 1:26-28 and Ephesians 2 verse 10, we shall look more closely into what it means to be made in the image of God, and for the church to be recreated and transformed more and more into the image and likeness of Christ. So first, Genesis 1. In the image of God, He created him. Male and female, He created them. There was something momentous, quite unique, in the creation of human beings. God intentionally made us into His image. The Hebrew term that was used for this is selem, an exact copy or reproduction, or at least a likeness. Demut, a resemblance or similarity. Bible scholars usually locate the content of this image in our reasoning faculty or in our capacity to make choices as moral agents. Perhaps a more comprehensive understanding of this image is our capacity to exercise dominion, as spelled out in what theologically is now known as the cultural mandate. It goes this way. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, over every living thing that moves upon the earth." We have a mandate to grow, to be fruitful, to multiply, to stamp our creativity upon the earth. There is something very wrong when we are not growing, when we do not use our productive and procreative powers for the flourishing of our families, of our economies, of our societies. At the same time, we are told to govern, to rule over creation. Now, this governance requires both effort and servanthood. The two Hebrew words that were translated as dominion are rada. Now, this means to trample, and kabas, which means to tread down. Ruling the earth requires hard work, even in the Garden of Eden before the fall. The first human beings were put into the garden to till it and to keep it. The word till, abad, also means to serve, and the word to keep, shamar, also means to watch or preserve. Leadership, whether over nature or society, does not mean that we lord it over others, as Jesus said. Dominion in the biblical sense is to serve, to watch over, to preserve the best of whatever has been given to us in creation. In the Garden of Eden, we are told that the Lord planted every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. Now notice that the trees were first of all for aesthetics, for beauty, to make the scenery, the landscape beautiful, and not just for their utility as food. This means that we must learn to live within the purposes and limits of the created order. We cannot grow more than we can actually govern. Way back in the 1970s, the Club of Rome had warned us that there are limits to growth. But economists, in the pursuit of maximizing profits, kept exploiting and degrading the environment. And we are seeing the result of it now. Certainly, we must grow our families, our businesses, our societies. But we must see to it that we are able to manage and govern this runaway growth in such a way that people truly flourish. Also, to fully image God means that we do this task together as men and women. Notice that sexual identity is at the heart of this image. I quote, "In the image of God, He created him. Male and female, He created them." In our families, in our enterprises, in our churches, and in our institutions, we are to see to it that there is an element of maleness and femaleness in whatever way cultures would want to define maleness and femaleness. We are told that we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works. We find that in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10. The reading of this famous text, dear to those of us who come from the Reformation tradition, those who believe in sola fide, sola gratia. We are saved not by works, but by faith alone and by grace alone. The reading of this usually glosses over verse 10. Quote, "For we are His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand, that we should walk in them." We are saved not just to secure a ticket to heaven, but to become, as it were, a poem, a piece of artwork. That is the meaning of the workmanship, crafted and recreated in the image of Jesus the Son, so that we may do that good work which God has purposed for us to do, long before we even became aware of what we were born to do. The church, as the body of Christ, makes visible the presence of Jesus on earth. As we get more and more conformed to the image of the Son, people see the hands of Jesus that heal. They hear the words that gave life. They feel the heart that reached out in compassion to the poor, the lame, the blind, those who are outcasts and in the margins of society. Communication theorists tell us that what people hear is only 30% of what is going on in a communication situation. What they see, all the nonverbals, how we affect people simply by the tone of our voice, the empathetic warmth of our community, our gestures of kindness and compassion. These comprise 70% of what is being communicated. This means that our talk, our messaging, has no power if we do not walk the talk. Marshall McLuhan, a long time ago, has already said that the medium is the message. The church, the images that people see as they watch us, is the message. When they walk into our churches, what do they see? What images come to mind? We are told that we are to image what our Lord Jesus is like. In the same way that our Lord, when He came to earth, gave us an image of the invisible God. We find that in Colossians 1:15. So what does all this mean to us as we experience this pandemic? In the cultural mandate, God invites us to create culture and not just critique the cultural artifacts that we see, whether movies, the internet, rock music, or books like the Da Vinci Code. Note that God, in his cultural mandate, left the harnessing of the sea, of sun and wind and rain, in other words, the raw creation, to the creative ingenuity of human beings. He left the science and technologies uninvented, the arts and music uncomposed, the poetry, the songs unsung. In Genesis 4, we see that it was Cain who built the city. It was his descendants who domesticated animals, who forged iron and bronze tools, who made music out of the flute and the lyre. But it was also from the line of Cain that we see weapons being invented. In what is called the Song of the Sword, Lamech boasts to his wives that he has killed a man for merely wounding him. The invention of the sword now enables him to get back at his enemies disproportionately. He says, if Cain is to be avenged 7 times, Lamech will get his vengeance 77 times. I would like to submit that if the Church of God does not get out there, does not make the presence of the kingdom of Jesus felt in the arts, in the sciences, in the marketplace, we will end up with scientific, economic, and cultural enterprises that kill the bodies and the souls of people. There is a great deal of debate these days as to whether the COVID-19 virus is genetically engineered or a product of natural evolution. The evidence is inconclusive, say some scientists. But what is clear is that China and the US collaborated together in setting up Lab 4 of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which sought to transmit a non-human virus said to be derived from bats to humans. Now it is worth asking, why would the US and China spend millions on a research that the scientific community saw as potentially a dangerous biological weapon? In contrast to this project, we see the work of scientists like Louis Pasteur, the French chemist and microbiologist of the 19th century. It was Louis Pasteur who discovered that microorganisms cause fermentation as well as disease. His science had practical consequences that greatly benefited people. He originated the process that we now know as pasteurization. He developed vaccines for anthrax, for rabies, and he saved the beer, the wine, and the silk industries in France by his technical inventions. Now my hope and prayer is that scientists like him would rise in this country and elsewhere. Scientists whose work springs from the sort of faith that is committed to human flourishing. Scientists who believe that we have it in us as people made in the image of God to create and invent all the medicine, all the technologies that are necessary to stop this pandemic. Another implication of the mandate to govern is the fact that we no longer really manage the world according to God's purposes. Much of the suffering and injustice in the world today is due to bad governance. The current pandemic has shown up the disastrous consequences of bad governance. Untold suffering has been caused by governments who delayed in responding to the seriousness of the disease, either for lack of morals that make for transparency or the competence and leadership that is necessary to get the wheels of bureaucracy moving. These days, unfortunately, the world is mostly in the hands of authoritarian leaders who take advantage of this pandemic to tighten social control and clamp down on dissent. In this country, for instance, protesters are clapped to jail, and the hungry poor who get crazy because they are so hungry, such that when they see food, they get crazy. These poor are threatened with mass arrest for violating physical distance. Now you and I know that this behavior, this physical or social distance, is not at all possible in crowded urban poor communities. I happen to believe that governments are bad because the churches are absent in the public space. I was in the U.S. when the Synod of the Presbyterian Church decided to allow same-sex marriage. In a conversation with the head of the research center where I was staying, I was asked if there is a way of arresting this drift towards secularism. I said it may be too late because 200 years ago, the Western churches started to isolate themselves from what they called the world, and they retreated into their spiritual ghettos, mumbling in corners about the meaning of their own symbols. Today, the images that people see are churches seeking to regain influence by becoming political blocs, behaving like any other vested interest. Only this time they are fighting for their rights and values as Christians in secular societies. But people do not hear a voice speaking justice for all. I hope that those of us who live in the majority world will not imitate this withdrawal from the public square. Instead, we must learn to articulate God's word, develop a language that is understandable, accessible in public space. So as parting remarks, let me say this. Part of why our faith is seen as irrelevant is that all that the world sees about Christianity are monuments in wood and stone, monuments to a bygone era of what we call Christendom. On the other hand, the tools and cultural artifacts that modern secular people devise to make our lives livable, or at least bearable, seem to be sufficient even without God. One thing good about this pandemic is that now that it happens, we come face to face with a vast emptiness that makes everything else useless. One of the things I am grateful for in this period of vacant waiting is being able to turn to the comfort of classical music, usually brought to us by the Far East Broadcasting Company, FEBC. Kapag nabuburyong ako when I'm working, I tune in to FEBC and I get transported to a world where there is neither poverty nor disease. Someone had asked me once how useful such a station could be in evangelizing people. But to me, awakening the aesthetic consciousness is also a spiritual task. It returns us to the core of who we are as God has made us. In other words, human. As the rock band ABBA sings it, without a song or a dance, what are we? That is from their song, Thank You for the Music. Without a song or a dance, what are we? There is a soul-stirring poignancy in the lonely figure of the Pope, making a sacramental gesture in an empty cathedral, or in Andrea Bocelli singing Amazing Grace against the empty streets of Paris, or London, or New York. These images remind us that against all that flattens us as merely creatures of nature, it tells us that there is something about us that longs for the spiritual, for the transcendent. As the Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky once put it, it is possible for a man to live without bread, but he cannot live without beauty. This to me is what it means to be made in the image of God, and what it also means to image His beauty.